Scope is a topic that we'll keep coming back to over and over throughout this course. It's important because at least when your JavaScript is run inside of a web browser, you must be aware of the topmost level of scope, which is referred to as global scope. In Node, like we're using here, it's not as much of an issue. They've got some safeguards against it. But in web development, working against the global scope is a crucial concern. A lot of consternation and consequently a lot of effort has been exerted to preach that declaring variables at the global scope is a bad idea. So you would never want to do something. Let me create a new file here. Returning functions.js. There we go. You never want to do something like this. Note the use of the var keyword. And you never want to do something like this. Although you're more likely to do it than the previous line in line number 1. Now, the reasons why you would never want to do this will require a little bit more explanation a little bit down the road. And I'll make this point emphatically when we start writing JavaScript for the web browser later on in this course. But for now, just understand that much of what I'll say and why I say it over the course of the next 5 or 6 lessons or so will be working towards a solution to avoid writing your code in the global scope if at all possible. Now, the eventual solution that I want to demonstrate relies on how JavaScript functions work, but we need to take a few baby steps to get there. So the first aspect of this technique that I want to demonstrate has to do with returning a function from a function. Now, up until now, our functions performed one or more actions and then exited quietly. We may have returned a simple value like true or high or something along those lines. However, we can create functions that can not only perform some action, but then at the very end can return a value to the caller, and not just any value, can return a function. So let me comment all this stuff out. And I'll say, don't do this to make sure you never do that. And this either. And then I'll just do a multi-line comment here. And so let's start off really simple. This is something that we've already talked about when we talked about declaring functions or function declarations. So here's function 1, and inside of function 1, we can just return the string 1, right? It's not very exciting, but it demonstrates the point that you can use the return keyword to return a value to whichever calls that. So for example, let value equals 1, for example. And what would we expect to be in our variable value? Well, we would expect to print out the string ONE or 1. So console.log and value, like so. And just to see this working, let's go ahead, say node, and then returning functions. And we see it returns here at the bottom of our screen the string 1 as we'd hoped. Now, we could also kind of paraphrase this, make this a little simpler by just doing it all in one line, right? So we could put the call to the function and not use a variable. We could just make the call to the function, which returns a string, and that returned value will automatically be passed into the console.log method. Let's save that. Hopefully that makes sense. And that's a common technique that we'll want to use. But things start to get a little bit more mind-bending when you start to think of a function as just another data type in JavaScript. So, for example, let's go back to this. I'm going to copy this again. And then let's go console.log and then type of value. All right. And well, let's do this. Let's get rid of the method invocation operator. So now we're just setting a reference called value to our function 1. Let's let's see what we get. And you can see the type is function. So let's think about all the data types we know about now. We know about string, we know about number, we know about Boolean, we know about undefined, and we know about function, right? And we're going to learn a couple more before this is all said and done. But at any rate, notice here again, in fact, we could even do this a little bit differently. I may have muddied the waters by introducing a variable. Let's just do that instead. And we should get the same result. All right. So I guess the heart of the matter here is that we can get a reference to a function, and we can store that reference to the function out in a variable, which means we could also do something like this. So now we have a reference to the function. We can call the function using the method invocation or the function invocation operator. So let's go ahead and run it. Whoops. I guess we need to actually then go console.log. There we go. Now we're getting somewhere. There we go. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. I just have a variable pointing to the function, and then now that I have a variable pointing to the function, I can execute the function by just using that variable with our method invocation operator, right? All right. Hopefully you're still with me so far. Hopefully this isn't too mind-bending. Let's continue on here. So since a function is just a data type like any other data type that we've learned about so far, our functions could return a function because we're just returning a value, right? And that value can be any type. So in other words, let's do this. Function2. And here we're going to do return a function. Now this is a function expression inside of a function declaration, right? And here console.log and 2, like so. And then do something like let my function equal 2. Now what gets returned to my function? It'll be this inner function expression. So I should be able to do something like my function with the method invocation operators. And let's see what we get. And we get the value 2 like we'd hoped. All right. So hopefully you can see here we're using the return keyword to return a function expression. We get a reference to that function expression by calling the outer function declaration. Now we have a function in hand, or reference to that function, this inner function right here, and we merely invoke it. Hopefully all that makes sense. And we might be able to do this a little bit differently. Let's try just a slightly different tact. So here I'm going to go function3, and here I'm going to return function and then return 3. All right. Oops, let me spell return correctly. All right, so in this case, I'm returning a function that returns a string. So I should be able to do something like console.log, and then I'm going to call 3. What do I get back from that? I should get back a function. So I should be able to invoke that function to get back the string to give to the console.log. Now you would never do this and you would never see this, but this is just to illustrate a point that of what you're really working with, and that's references. Whoops, let's actually execute it. There we go, 3. What you're working with here are references to functions that can return references to other things and maybe even other functions, right? So again, that last one's pretty far-fetched. You probably never do that. But the fact is that what gets returned from our 3 function declaration is a function, and then it can be invoked with the function invocation operator here, the second set of inner parentheses right there. All right. So on the surface, this might not seem like a very significant development in our JavaScript journey, but nothing actually could be further from the truth, because this is actually a huge step towards moving our code out of the global namespace like I talked about at the beginning of this video. But to complete the story, again, we have several more baby steps to go. We're going to need to step away from functions for a little bit and come back to them once we've learned a little bit more about arrays and objects specifically. All right, so just keep this thought in mind and we'll continue on. You're doing great. Hang in there. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks.